"The village is mistaken," he stated simply. She looked up at him, surprised by the clarity in his voice. He met her gaze unflinchingly. "You know," she began after a pause, "people spoke of things, even when Thomas was alive, about your closeness." His brow furrowed. "Did they?" She nodded. "They wondered if you two were closer than soldiers ought to be." He chuckled dryly. "They were partly right." That startled her. She turned to him, her eyes searching. "Partly?" "It wasn't Thomas." The wind stirred, carrying the scent of fading roses and the first hint of frost. She didn't ask him to elaborate. She didn't need to. But she felt the world shift subtly beneath her feet. And for the first time in 10 years, she didn't feel entirely alone. The next morning, frost painted the windows in silver. Eleanor awoke to the soft flutter of sparrows across the eaves, their wings whispering against the pale dawn. She drew her shawl tighter as she moved through the house, still half immersed in forgotten dreams. Arthur's teacup from yesterday still sat on the side table, faintly stained. She hadn't the heart to wash it. She told herself it meant nothing. People came and went. People had always come and gone, but something about Arthur Croft's presence had pried open a quiet chamber of her heart she had long since sealed shut. She found him in the garden again, early, silent, already halfway down the path. She watched him from the drawing room window, his coat buttoned high, gloved hands clasped behind his back, like a man reviewing a deep memory. When he turned and caught her watching, he didn't smile. He simply raised one hand, slowly and respectfully. Not a wave, but a gesture of acknowledgement, of profound recognition. And that, somehow, was more unsettling. She joined him after breakfast. They walked without speaking for a time. The garden wasn't as wild as it appeared, but she let it maintain its illusion. Nature knew how to embrace grief, and she had simply followed its example. "Did you ever marry?" she asked, surprising herself. "No," Arthur said, without looking at her. "I never found it in me to pretend." "Pretend?" "That it would be fair to someone else." "Fair," she echoed. He didn't reply at once, then quietly. "Some people deserve more than a half-hearted affection." Some answers required no elaboration. They carried their own weight in silence. And some silences spoke volumes. She hadn't sat there with anyone in years. Thomas used to rest there when his cough worsened, a blanket draped across his knees, watching the last leaves fall. Arthur waited for her to sit first. When she did, he took the opposite end, leaving a respectful space between them. Enough for a breath, a memory, or perhaps a lingering boundary. "Do you ever consider it?" she asked after a long while. "Consider what?" "Starting anew." He didn't answer immediately. Then, "Every time I return." He looked down at his hands, fingers loosely flexed in his lap. She remembered those hands. He'd once tended Thomas's fever with them, bandaged his broken wrist. There had been such tenderness in them even then. But something else now, weariness, a profound containment. "You seem older," she said without thinking. He looked at her. "So do you." Then he smiled, just faintly. "But it suits you." There are compliments that are merely charming, and then there are those that bypass defenses and settle deep within the heart, uninvited. This was the latter. Later that day, Eleanor found herself standing at the door of the small, spare room she'd never dared open since Thomas's passing. It still held his coat, his walking stick, a stack of his well-loved travel books, their pages yellowed with time and touch. She stood there, her hand on the doorknob, for a long time, then closed it again. That evening, she set out 2 cups instead of 1. She didn't ask if Arthur would visit, she simply assumed he would. And when the soft, respectful, hesitant knock came, she didn't startle, she simply lit another candle. He brought with him a book, an old, leather-bound volume of poetry by Keats. He offered no explanation, simply handed it to her. "You used to read aloud," he said. "I remember your voice." She felt a blush rise to her cheeks, absurd and unexpected. "Well," she said, clearing her throat, "let's see if it still works." She read 3 poems. His eyes never left her face, not in a hungry way, not in a desperate way, in the way a man listens to a piece of music he never thought he'd hear again. After the 3rd, her voice wavered slightly. It wasn't the poem, it was the feeling that time had folded in on itself again, and she didn't know whether to lean into it or retreat. "You always made things sound softer," Arthur said quietly. She closed the book. "I always hoped someone was listening." Sometimes you forget how much you need to be heard, until someone listens without needing to speak, and then something within you breaks open. The next day, he returned, not with a knock or a letter, not with poetry or pretense. He simply appeared again, walking the path as if it were his own, not out of entitlement, but memory. He paused by the wisteria wall, fingertips brushing a brittle vine that had succumbed to the frost. Then he moved toward the bench under the oak tree, where the sun still clung to the earth, reluctant to depart. Eleanor saw him from the kitchen window. She didn't move at first, she simply stood there, holding a dish towel as if deciding whether to step into the moment or let it pass. Then she poured a 2nd cup of tea. They didn't speak for the first few minutes. He sat on the bench. She joined him, her hands curled around her cup. The silence between them wasn't awkward now. It had shape, rhythm, like a breath they'd both learned to take in unison. Finally, she said, "You didn't say you were coming." "I wasn't sure I would," he replied, his eyes fixed on the last leaves clinging to the tree. But it felt wrong not to. Some people leave without warning. Others return without permission. The rarest ones simply arrive because their absence would speak louder. "I almost didn't come out," she said after a moment. He glanced at her. "Why?" "Because I thought perhaps you weren't coming for me." His expression didn't change, but his voice lowered. "I don't come here for anyone else." That afternoon, he helped her carry firewood. He didn't ask. He simply saw the basket beside the hearth and brought it in, his sleeves rolled up, hands steady. "You're too distinguished for this," she said, watching him ease a log into the flames. "I was a battlefield medic," he replied. Dignity wasn't part of the job. They stood beside the fire for a while. The light caught the side of his face, the fine lines etched by time, the faint scar near his ear she hadn't noticed before. She almost asked about it, but stopped herself. Some things were best left unnamed, and some questions were only asked when you were truly ready for their answers. "You used to keep a portrait of Thomas in the hall," he said. "I moved it." "Why?" She didn't answer at first. Then, "Because it was always watching, and I don't need watching anymore." The departed do not ask permission to remain. They linger where they are placed until the living dare to move them. The next morning he came again, this time with a jar of something golden and thick. "Damson jam," he said, "from a woman in town who owed me a favor. I told her you preferred understated flavors." "Understated?" she asked. He shrugged. "The kind that don't demand much, but linger long after." She stared at the jar. "That's the most absurd description of fruit I've ever heard." He smiled. "But accurate." Later, as she sat on the back steps trimming lavender, a strange calm settled around her. Not because he was nearby, but because she didn't feel the usual burden of waiting. For once, she wasn't bracing for loneliness. She was simply existing. And that was enough. But not everyone shared her newfound ease. When she went into the village 2 days later for bread, eggs, and thread, she noticed the gazes. Women who once offered kind nods now extended only polite silence. The butcher, usually jovial, handed her change without a word. It was the curate's wife who made the first direct jab. "I hear your late husband's associate has been calling," she said, arranging a bundle of leeks in her basket. "He has." "Daily?" "Almost." The woman offered a smile, intended to appear maternal, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Well," the woman continued, "grief can make us cling to the nearest hand, can't it? But one must be careful not to mistake proximity for providence." Eleanor said nothing. She didn't need to. That night, Arthur didn't appear. She waited until the fire had dwindled to embers, then she put away the second cup. She didn't sleep much. He came the next morning. She met him at the door before he could speak. "Did you change your mind?" "No," he said quietly. "But I thought perhaps I'd made things difficult for you." "You did." He nodded once. "I'm sorry." "I didn't say I minded." They stood there for a long moment. He didn't ask to come in. She didn't invite him. But they didn't move either. Finally, she stepped aside and he followed. They sat in the kitchen this time, not the parlor. It felt more authentic somehow. She cut bread. He watched her hands. She offered him a slice, and he took it with care as if it were something sacred. "I heard what they're saying," he murmured. "I imagine you did. You should tell me to leave." "I won't." "Why not?" She looked at him then, truly looked. "Because I don't want you to." Desire is a quiet thing. When it has waited long enough, it stops shouting. It simply chooses to stay. She could have laughed, could have looked away, but she didn't. She met his gaze and held it like something simultaneously precious and fragile. Outside, the wind rattled the shutter once. Then it grew still, as if the whole world had paused to see if she would speak. But she didn't. Not yet. Some moments deserved stillness before sound. She reached for the bread knife again, not to cut, but merely to steady her hand. And when he reached across the table and covered it with his own, she didn't pull away. He didn't pull away either. For a moment, there was nothing in the room but the sound of the fire and the ticking clock behind them. Her hand beneath his felt small, yet steady. She didn't look at him right away. She simply stared at their hands, as if trying to memorize the shape of this moment, something she could cling to if it vanished. She drew in a breath, not sharp, but slow, as if she hadn't realized until now that she'd been holding the last one. "I thought I'd forgotten what it felt like," she said, barely above a whisper. "Not to be loved, just to be known, without needing to explain anything." His thumb brushed the top of her hand, not a stroke, just a lingering pause, like punctuation. She looked at him now, fully.
After Thomas died, I convinced myself there wouldn't be anyone else. Not because I couldn't find someone, but because I couldn't bear the thought of starting from the beginning, teaching someone who I am, how I function, what I need when I retreat into myself.
He didn't interrupt. He didn't flinch.
"You already know,"
she said. "I do," Arthur replied. The answer came simply, not as a vow, but as an undeniable truth. "You remember how I take my tea. You don't ask questions you already know the answers to, and you wait, even when it's uncomfortable. You always disliked being rushed," he said softly. A small, broken yet real laugh escaped her. "I did." She slipped her hand from beneath his and stood, not abruptly, but simply to move. Her body needed to do something besides feel. He waited. She knew he would. She walked to the window, arms folded. The frost had returned overnight, tracing clear patterns against the garden wall.
"I'm not afraid of being alone,"
she said, still watching the yard.
"I grew accustomed to it. I even came to appreciate it. But I was always a little afraid that no one would ever know me like Thomas did. And now I'm afraid because you do."
He stood, but didn't come closer. He remained, "You don't have to." Silence settled again, not empty, but rich with unsaid things. She stepped forward, slow and certain, and he met her there. When he kissed her, it wasn't sudden, it wasn't passionate or overwhelming. It was quiet, like the closing chords of a song she hadn't realized had been playing all along. And when it ended, she didn't step back. She simply let her forehead rest against his chest, just for a moment. That night, they didn't speak of what came next. But he didn't leave. She prepared the guest room for him, and he accepted it, not out of politeness, but because that was simply where they were. Not rushing, just choosing. The next day, the curate's wife came again. Eleanor answered the door herself. "You've had company," the woman said, peering past her shoulder. "I have," Eleanor replied. "And how long will he be staying?" "As long as I want him to." The curate's wife hesitated, then, "People will talk." Eleanor smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, just plainly. "Let them." She closed the door. Her son David arrived the following week, unexpected, unannounced. The train from London had brought with it a chill and a stiffness that reminded her of his father. He stood in the doorway, coat still on, surprise flickering across his features as Arthur stepped out from the kitchen with a dish towel in hand. "Mr. Croft?" David said. Neutral, measured. "Hello, David," Arthur replied. Eleanor poured tea while they exchanged pleasantries. She noticed David watching her hands as if he didn't quite recognize them. Later, alone in the sitting room, David asked quietly, "Is this serious?" She looked at him. "I'm not asking your permission." "I didn't say you needed it," he replied. "Good," she said, "because I don't." He nodded slowly. "I just want you to be careful." "I was careful for 58 years, Eleanor said. "Now, I want to be alive." David didn't argue. He kissed her cheek before he left, and Arthur didn't speak of it afterward. That night, she passed by the sewing room where Thomas's portrait now hung. She didn't pause, she didn't feel guilty. She just walked on, toward the kitchen where Arthur was waiting. The days passed in small, tangible ways. He helped chop wood. She painted again. They ate at the table instead of in silence. Sometimes they sat by the fire and said nothing at all. One morning she found him outside, repairing a loose board on the garden gate. "You don't have to do that," Eleanor called. "I know," Arthur said, "but I want to." She stood in the doorway, watching him, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't wonder how long something good might last.